Good evening, everyone. My name's Alan Miller. I want to start with an apology for keeping everyone waiting for an hour. Really sorry about that. Baroness Fox, who's also the director and the founder of the Academy of Ideas, was delayed in Parliament today in the House of Lords with some emergency talks that she had to speak on. I'm pleased that you're with us, and as I say, we're sorry for the delay, but we want to get right into it. We're very lucky to have both speakers this evening. This is part of a series that Together has put together, the Together Talks, that are looking at various bits of legislation that are being brought in, from the Human Rights Act to the Online Safety Bill, which we discussed last week, and tonight the Police Crime Courts and Sentencing Bill, which particularly Section 4 has a number of measures that anyone who's interested or concerned about the rights to protest and congregate will obviously have been looking at, and we've seen words like things being too noisy and demonstrations being able to be stopped, but also a range of other measures that are to do with legislation and crime, and whether we've got enough laws already or not, and what that means. And I'm very pleased to introduce Harry Miller. Harry Miller of Fair Cop, who was in the police services and is also been a businessman and entrepreneur, and he's the chairman of Reclaim. And I was actually successful when we're talking about online safety bill and things you can and cannot say, and if they're a crime or not. And we're waiting to find out if tomorrow legal but harmful is going to be taken out of the online safety bill. But Harry was successful in challenging some things that could be said and not said. And that was a very important contribution to that. And so this evening, what we want to look at, as I say, is the Police Crime Sentencing Court Bill. It's a big mouthful, but also to look at what's led to it, what it's going to mean for us, and what we might be able to do about it. And just some ground rules. You know by now, we are going to say hello to all the people that are watching this in live venues, particularly to Rock Point Leisure, Dan Davis, the regional ambassador, who's doing great work up there in New Brighton and the Wirral. They'll probably have a little cheer there. We'll share some of those photos later. But we're going to look to have the introductory remarks from Harry and then Baroness Fox. And then I'm going to ask a few questions from them. And then I'm going to come over to you guys to ask questions, make contributions. And as ever, you know, things can be complicated. We may disagree about things, and that's fine. But we do it in a grown-up, civil way. And we do what we haven't had enough of, which is we have free speech and open debate, because we're adults and we can cope with that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Harry for some of your reflections. Harry, thank you for joining us.
Okay. So thanks for having me on, Alan. One of the things that I hoped when I set out on my campaign against, first of all, the Chief Constable of Humberside and then the wider College of Policing, was that, one, we would get favourable rulings, which of course we did in both instances, although in the case of the College of Policing, we had to go higher than the High Court. We had to go all the way to the Court of Appeal. But my hope was that at any rate, it wouldn't simply be a victory for me. Hi, Claire, you see there. It wouldn't simply be a victory for me, but that it would be a victory for all of us who believe in common law, for all of us who believe in free speech, and all of us who believe in our British identity. One of the things that separates us from the Europeans and many other nations, in actual fact, is our common law. And that basically is the right for us to say, speak, think, do, act freely and at absolute will, right up until a specific point where the law says this far and no further. We differ from the Europeans in that this is not based on the exercise of permissions. We don't act in a certain way because the state allows us to. We simply stop acting in a certain way because the state has decided this far and no further. And my worry with particularly in my case, was based around the non-crime hate incident, where even where a pattern of speech or something that you said was not classed as criminal, the police viewed it as being dangerous enough to be recordable. There was no possibility of having it struck out, no possibility of arguing your way out of it. No, there was no appeal to rhyme nor reason nor reasonableness. In fact, the College of Policing put into its guidance a definite firm restriction on any test of reasonableness. They said that by questioning the perception of someone who thought that speech was hateful, that itself, the very act of questioning, was itself a non-crime hate incident. So that left you in the position where you simply had to suck it up. You had to live in a world where, because of something that you'd said that wasn't criminal, you had to just accept the fact that you were now going to be on a police database, and that this database was potentially going to damage your career, because via an enhanced DBS check, the chief constable could, at his or her will, decide to reveal your non-crime hate incident. In other words, reveal you as a hater to a potential employer. And we thought that was fundamentally wrong, fundamentally unfair, fundamentally un-British. So we took it all the way through to the High Court and then through to the Court of Appeal. And that rotten perception-based recording of non-crime hate incidents has been struck down. It's been classed as unlawful. What's interesting, though, is the response by the College of Policing, who only last month, and this is, this was declared unlawful on, I think, December the 20th. And in February, we received a letter from them saying that they may alter the guidance to make it lawful. May alter it. That seems very bizarre, a very bizarre response from a body which its one task is to make sure that the police do their job and do it efficiently. And the number one task of a police force is to uphold the law. So the fact that the College of Policing are dragging their heels, dragging their feet when it comes to complying with the law is very, very worrying. And this I think speaks to the separation that we have now between law and our bodies, the quango, such as the College of Policing. The College of Policing employs, I think, 650 odd people. It's got a budget of 60 million. If you work out the number of, if you work out the number of people versus its income from the government, I think it works out at, on average, each person is paid around about £56,000, which interestingly is exactly twice the amount it costs to take on a new police officer. But they appear to be operating above and beyond the law. They seem to be on some form of virtuous mission to save our souls, to make us as woke as is humanly possible. And all of it is done under the guise of protecting us from harm. Protecting us from harm. In other words, the state and the agencies of the state, the quangos of the state, have taken an overly paternalistic view of their relationship between themselves and we as citizens or subjects. So now with the online safety bill, with the police and crimes bill, there is a overarching emphasis on protecting us, as though we need protecting, as though all of our agency is as dust, as though it's nothing. As it's taken on the socialist idea, I think, that we belong to the state and it's the state's job, the state's role and task to look after us in a paternalistic manner from the cradle all the way through adulthood, right the way to the grave. And I find that depressing, find it very un-British, and I find it dangerous. And particularly when they talk a lot about hate and hate speech. Well, I think if you're a reasonable person, you'd want to know if they're going to restrict your speech based on hate. You'd want to have a reasonable definition of what hate speech is. Well, handily, the College of Policing and the CPS give us a definition of what hate speech is. And they say, in the absence of a precise legal, in the absence of a precise legal definition, consideration should be given to ordinary definitions, which include, get this, ill will, ill feeling, spite, contempt, prejudice, unfriendliness, antagonism, resentment, and dislike. Well, I would argue that our democracy is based on a system of antagonism. It's based on a system where we challenge. It's not an inquisitorial system. It's an antagonistic system where we face up to one another with our different ideas and we battle it out. And whoever wins, well, that then becomes the law. It's an antagonistic system. I don't think the state has any right whatsoever to be criminalizing unfriendliness, ill will, ill feeling, and dislike. And that's why I think all of the measures that are being suggested in the name of protecting us, they, at the very least, we need to question them. In fact, we need to be antagonistic towards them. And the deep irony there is that by being antagonistic, we are in fact committing hate.
Thank you, Harry. Lots to think there. And maybe we'll have an antagonistic but civil discussion about all those things. But now, very pleased to welcome Baroness Fox. Over to you, please, Claire. Thank you.
First of all, I'm really sorry for messing you around. It's the nature of the place, which I'm going to actually talk about. Okay, so I'm going to concentrate on part 3 of the Police and Crime Bill, which is the part that deals with protest. The points that Harry made are so important, but as it happens, they come in a different part of the bill. But the kind of big headlines have been around protest, so that's what I'm dealing with. And the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, has said that the right to protest is a cornerstone of our democracy. But there's no doubt about it. If the whole of part 3 goes through, protest is under threat. But just to note to your audience that we're a bit late to this party because we have a democratic dilemma here. The government's position is that the protest parts of the bill are in response to what they say is a significant change in protest tactics that have resulted from the hindrance of work of emergency services, disruption of ordinary people's lives around groups like Extinction Rebellion and Insulate Britain. And there's no doubt about it, there is popular support in the public for dealing with those protesters. And so you could say that the government have a popular mandate for their anti-protest suggestions. Now, the Lords voted against practically all of the anti-protest proposals by the government. But this is the other democratic dilemma. The Lords are unelected, right? And so lots of people were thankful that the Lords stopped that initially, but let's be honest, why should the Lords who are unelected stop what the government who are elected propose? So we've got a dilemma there, which I'd like to know what you think. At this stage, we are at a point where those proposals were rejected, sent back to the House of Commons, and they're about to reappear before the Lords again in what's known as ping pong, and they will go between the two houses. And it's, to be frank, very likely that the government will get most of its way, and there's very little that the Lords can do about it. But anyway, my argument when it came up in the Lords, so to just rehearse it, was that legislation already exists by the bucket load to deal with the new tactics that we've seen from Insulate Britain, Extinction Rebellion. Because, for example, under the Public Order Act 1986, the police already have huge powers to impose conditions and prohibit protests, as well as a broad discretion in law about how those laws are applied. And it's, for example, already a criminal offence to obstruct or hinder emergency workers under the Emergency Workers Obstruction Act 2006. And there's lots of parts of the law that could have been used against those protesters. I think that the interesting thing is, if there's a reluctance or hesitation from the police in intervening, for example, whether it's protesters clogging up the M25, or indeed protesters toppling statues in Bristol, then I think that that reflects more of a political problem in the police than it does a lack of laws.
Yep.
There's a sort of loss of nerve, I think, in the police in some ways, or they've become politicized, or they've lost their moral authority. I've got to vote while I'm doing this, right? So I'm going to carry on, but vote. I can vote virtually, right? Right. So I don't think that legislation about creating a police state, as some argue, right? So I don't think this legislation is about creating a police state. That's a very important point that I want to emphasize to you, and I'm so sorry about this stupid distraction. I don't think that this legislation, therefore, is about creating a police state, because a lot of people have tried to suggest that. If anything, it represents to me the weakness of the coherence of the British police force. And rather than the government tackle a kind of degeneration at the soul of the British police force, its instinct is to try and use legislation to attempt to get the police to assert their moral authority more by bolstering their authority and giving them more powers. But actually, that doesn't tackle the core problem, which is the police have decided not to bother being the police of late, for all sorts of reasons that we might want to talk about. But therefore, I think accusing the government of introducing a police state doesn't really work. The legislation, as it happens, around protests is pretty incoherent. And I think that this is one of the reasons why they're just kind of lashing out, trying to bring in laws all the time to try and improve policing, but they don't really have a clear plan. So initially, in the original bill, most of the sections focused on protest, centered on restrictions that could be imposed if the noise generated by people taking part could result in intimidation or harassment of, quote, persons of reasonable firmness, or, quote, may cause such persons to suffer serious unease, alarm, or distress. In other words, if those parts of the bill go through, the police can intervene to stop a protest if there's even a risk that people in the vicinity, people of a certain firmness, could be upset by the noise, with an absurdly low threshold as well. Now, that's been much ridiculed, and understandable, because after all, demonstrations are supposed to cause upset one way or another, and they're definitely supposed to cause noise. And the kind of protests that you want are big, noisy, loud. That's the whole purpose of them. So when they try and kind of stop the noise, it hardly indicates support for protest. But also, it makes a mockery of the idea that those sections of the bill were targeting the likes of Extinction Rebellion. Because I don't know if you've ever been around those Extinction Rebellion things, but half the time they're kind of doing silent mime and things, right? They're not loud at all, right? They're not the noisy protester types. You know, they kind of, so that's another thing. What's more is the noise provisions in particular will drag the police into an even murkier set of political rather than operational dilemmas, because the police are now going to be given such broad discretion, it's almost inevitable that they'll be seen as facilitating some protests, which they'll say are not okay, and others which they'll clamp down on because they're too noisy. And that's likely to make public order situations more difficult for frontline officers. And to quote one SOAS policy briefing, which I thought was useful, it said, the bill compels the police to make decisions about whether protests can go ahead, and therefore forces the police to become a visible, controversial actor in ordinary political debates and how things are resolved. The government, however, did realise, because there was a lot of fuss about the noise provision in particular, and also a provision that was about ensuring that there were no protests around Parliament Square in particular. The government realised that that anti-protest section was controversial. Rather than backing off, what it did was it rushed through at the 11th hour in the Lords, before going to the Commons, right at the last minute as the Lords were discussing it, pages and pages of new clauses and amendments that were much more obviously aimed at a new type of protest. So they brought in, for example, they're proposing bringing in 2 offences of locking on and being equipped to lock on, i.e. the idea that you would attach yourself to a railings or attach yourself to a building or whatever. And those offences carry a maximum term of prison of 51 weeks, nearly a year, or unlimited fines. These locking on laws will criminalise a list of activities involving people attaching themselves to a whole range of objects or land, but they're so vague that you could potentially be done for harmlessly linking arms with someone and be said to be locking on. So you see where we might go with that. The vague nature of the word attach, which is not defined in the bill, is something of great worry. Also, there's a new offence of being equipped to lock on. So that doesn't mean you have to do anything, right? That means that you can be a person. You can basically be walking down with an object with you in a place. What it says is in a place other than a dwelling, with the intention that it would be used. And the kind of things that we get here are bike chains. There was literally a long discussion about bike chains. Say you get stopped with a bike chain. And somebody said, well, you know, to the minister, well, your bike chain might be perfectly innocent for having a bike chain on you. And she said, if you can prove that your bike chain is for a use of locking up your bike, you'll be all right. In other words, you have to get permission to prove that you're not going on a demo with a bike chain to attach yourself to some railing or whatever. The new provisions also include what are known as serious disruption prevention orders. These are serious disruption prevention orders, SDPOs, as I will know, are based on the existing football banning orders. And lots of us were worried about football banning orders before, but because, of course, they were only aimed at football yobs, I say that in inverted commas, nobody took any notice of them. But like all of these things, they've been basically cut and paste almost into the bill, but now for protesters. This will remove an individual's right to attend a protest. So football banning orders stops you going to a football match if you're named with a football banning order, right? You're not allowed to go. You're banned, right? And protest banning, serious disruption prevention orders will stop people having the right to attend a protest, and they create a criminal liability based on a civil or lower burden of proof. So they're not, you can get done criminally, but you're not charged in a criminal court. See what I mean? So you've got a lower burden of proof. I'm sorry if I'm rushing. SDPOs, serious disruption prevention orders, can be imposed on a person over 18 who has 2 or more protest-related criminal offences on 2 separate occasions within a 5-year period. Now, I'm mentioning that because I hope I've pointed out to you that you might have got a criminal offence on a protest if you were too noisy up the road, right? Or if you had a bike chain up the road. So it's quite easy to have acquired those criminal offences. A person on an SDPO is subject to a set of strict conditions, including that they'll be banned from visiting certain places or particular activities, carrying certain items, using the internet or communication apps to carry out protest-related activities, i.e., if you're on an SDPO and you even advertise a protest that you're not going to because you're banned, you can then be in breach of your SDPO. SDPO aims to criminalise and subject individuals to intrusive monitoring based on what they might do in the future rather than what they have done in the past. That's the significant thing. Last point. Also worrying is the creation of new protest-specific stop and search powers that could debilitate protests before they begin. Now think about stop and search. At the moment, stop and search is limited to very specific contexts. The threat of serious personal injury, such as gangs, knife crime, terrorism. But now the powers for stop and search are being deployed in relation to protests in a very different context. The police will be given the right to search protesters, peaceful protesters, even without reasonable suspicion, is written into the bill, right? Even without reasonable suspicion of having committed offence, but they can just stop and search you on the basis that you could be about to offend. And that's surely, by the way, a catalyst for an even more negative relationship between the police and the public, because they're going to get themselves into all sorts of messes. So practically what to do? I'm afraid there's not much time to do anything about this bill because it's at the end of the process, not much to be done. But I would emphasise the second set of amendments were, if you were going to be campaigning, were undemocratically rushed through the undemocratic House of Lords. I'd focus on the serious disruption prevention orders and have a campaign against them, because even though they're going to be brought in, I'd just try and campaign to get rid of them. The noise triggering amendments may probably go. They're a bit mad. I would emphasise that the government did try and circle off the geographical protect Parliament geographically, because I think that's particularly egregious. But if you really want my advice, is probably the right to protest is a bit screwed. So I would concentrate on something like the online safety bill and Harry's non-crime hate incidents. But I would make a point of making a fuss publicly about serious disruption prevention orders, which I don't think the public know enough about. And I'm sorry about that mad rushed introduction.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you, Harry. This question of authority, I think that we've seen, and a lot of people have talked about the cliches, that some of the police felt incapable of chasing people on motorbikes because of health and safety, or removing people from demonstrations because they didn't want to get accused of that. And it actually could have been very crippling to the police. But at the same time, people who would have been on protests recently, where there was kettling and there was actual rounding up and actual physically attacks on some of those citizens marching, but obviously different demos got treated quite differently. And I suppose the question is this: when you talk about it isn't like a police state just running out of control, Claire, the question about what authority really means in your eyes, and if there's enough laws, and why it is that there's a kind of impulse to bring in more. Why is it not the sense that you could, if it's so popular in the public to deal with these people, and we saw many members of the public actually doing that themselves, so I think you got a fair point there. Why would it not be the case that they would feel like there would be some authority to deal with it? And I suppose the question to you, Harry, as well, is like, to what extent you might have seen those changes in the police play out from when you were there to now? Because obviously we see the police being under a lot of pressure to deal with all sorts of things, from cybercrime to paedophilia to terrorism and everything, and also having their resources reduced. But it seems more than just a practical, logistical question, right? There's this question of what the police are there for. Are they health and safety officers, or should they be something that's stronger and more robust? So whoever wants to go first, Harry, you got your hand up, so you go first, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I think particularly since the Macpherson report, the police have had something of a collapse in their own, a collapse in confidence. I think that coupled with the meddling of the College of Policing has left us with a police service which should be very effective because it recruits very good people still, but which is somehow stymied from behaving like a proper police force. I had a discussion with the Deputy Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police about why they didn't arrest those protesters who were bringing those, I think they were XR protesters at the bank buildings where they'd taken hammers to the glass. And their response was, well, the trouble is, Harry, protesters know that all they need to do is go into the flop position and then we're unable to do anything. I said, well, why is that? He said, well, because when they flop, it then becomes a health and safety concern, because in order to move them, we need 5 police officers. We need 1 for each leg, 1 for each arm, and then 1 for their head. And so it's far better for us just to leave them to it, because we can't deal with that. Well, that's nonsense. Back in my time, if somebody took a hammer to a building, let alone a bank building, we'd just haul them off and throw them in the back of the van and take them down to the nick. And that's the right thing to do as far as I'm concerned. That would have, I think, massive approval. And the other thing, Claire quite rightly points out, that the police have got powers. There are loads of powers that the police could have employed to get rid of these egregiously disruptive protests without threatening the right to protest itself. And again, it comes down to a lack of confidence by the police in themselves. Again, part of that is down to that they're so busy learning about procedures, that they neglect to learn the law. And where they do know the law, that law then becomes subject to a set of procedures in terms of how you apply it. So it's a lack of confidence. After I defeated the Chief Constable of Humberside, I had an afternoon tea with him, and I said, look, I understand why a police officer, a young police officer, gets it wrong, but why, when the entire world starts looking at you, why did somebody in authority higher up the chain of command, why did they not apply a degree of common sense? And he looked at me and he said, the thing is, Harry, what you've got to understand is that common sense is not an appropriate tool for a police officer. What we need is more guidance. And I find that's incredibly scary, because it undermines the decision-making processes of the police. If you have to follow a tick box exercise, a prescriptive set of how-tos and what not tos that are cascaded down from the College of Policing, of course, you're going to spend your life terrified of doing the wrong thing. And this is, I think, is the reason why the police have not applied existing law. And I think that the government has hoped to sort of restart them by introducing something that's bright and fresh and shiny that they can all understand, and suddenly have a renewed confidence to go out and do it. But there's no need for any of these new laws. We've got more than enough laws in existence already.
Harry, that really, you explained what I was trying to explain. You explained it much better than me. That's really what's happened. I mean, I agree with you that what's happened is that they've, for whatever reason, they've lost our confidence. And the reason I was emphasizing that it's not a police state thing was sometimes people present it as though this is kind of like a top-down plan to clamp down on everything. But what's really happened is that the capacity for the police to use their nous about policing has got lost somewhere. Now, I mean, I was often on the receiving end of some of that policing, you know, myself as somebody who was on a lot of protests, you know, but at least I kind of knew how to handle it. You know what I mean? Like in the miners' strike, they're pretty tough, right? I'm not saying I liked it, but at least you knew where you were. Very straightforward. They represented the state and all the rest of it. Now they're all over the place. The inconsistency in the kind of demos that they do intervene in is very mixed. I mean, you know, what was the Sarah Everard about? That seems to contradict the kind of idea they've all gone woke. You know, they didn't. There's a kind of like, what should we do mentality. But I think there's also an attempt to ingratiate themselves with the public as well, because there's this sort of sense in which the police feel as though they've lost this authority. So somehow they kind of go for fashionable causes to get in with the public. So that's another thing that's gone wrong. But politics has become very performative. I thought it was quite interesting that we got hacked, or, you know, this call got hacked, and the way that the person thought that they would hack it was by showing rude pictures. That was also performative. It's like, sort of, do you think that's do you know what I mean? Like, do you think we haven't seen things like that before? What you like, right? Don't be a prat. Do you know what I mean? Like, oh, you know, but it's like, and so the government feel they have to be seen to be doing something. The only thing they can think of to be seen to be doing is to introduce new laws. They then introduce these kind of loads of new laws all at once in a kind of shock and awe way to try and force the police to do something. But when you actually look at the small print, it's going to get the police into more of a muddle, which is what I was trying to imply would be what happened. And also, it's like as though they've taken, you know, the people in the Home Office have obviously been sitting on, it's like every anti-protest law that anyone had ever thought of for the last 25 years has got dragged out. You know what I mean? It's like a sort of like melee. Oh, now's our chance to throw it all at them. But it's completely incoherent. And that's why what was really weird was when they brought in the first lot of anti-protest laws saying this is about insulate Britain, it bore no relationship then to do it insulate Britain. And then they went, oh, and so there's an out of control nature to this, which is actually, of course, more scary, because authoritarian rule where you've got a kind of plan, it's kind of clear what you know what's going on. Arbitrary illiberalism from a government and from the police is more frightening, because you can't even work out what you can do and what you can't do. And that's in a way, and that's the way I think we all feel about free speech at the moment. You're kind of constantly walking on eggshells, and now you're going to be constantly protesting on eggshells. You're not quite sure. And I think that we do know what that feels like, because 2 years of lockdown with all those guidances, and some things were rules and some things were laws, and you were never quite sure if you're going to get fined for sitting on a park bench or not, or were you allowed to talk to more than 2 people at once, or all that palaver. That kind of ebbed. It did sap our confidence, I think, as a public. You know, maybe not people in together and you all got organised, but you know, the millions and millions of people in this country, they've had the stuffing knocked out of them right now, because they just kind of weren't treated as law-abiding citizens unless they broke the law, you know, which is what you generally are. You're a law-abiding citizen that the state and politicians and government leave alone unless you break into someone's house or try and stab someone or try and break the law. When there's laws flying around all over the place, then who becomes a law-abiding citizen is much more uncertain. And that, I think, is going to ultimately undermine law and order, which actually, by the way, I do want the police to tackle law and order, because there are problems. It's not as though if you live in certain areas in the country, you're sitting around going, oh, isn't it hunky-dory? You do actually want somebody to go and catch the odd criminal, because there are criminal activities going on out there that the police are completely distracted from by all of this activity around their constantly expanded roles.
Thank you, Claire. I want to do one more question just back to you, because it is the case that, well, do you guys think it's the case that this has come about not just immediately, but over a long period of time? If we remember what seemed like a long time ago now, when you had the young people and they were saying that the riots, and the police sort of seemed to not know what to do, and they ended up being kind of looting and some breaking into shops, and it just got out of control, which was initially, perhaps there was something you could say might have had a kernel of something political, but you know, with the Mark Duggan case and the situation there in Tottenham, then it completely gets out of control and goes around the country. But you know, the point that Claire makes, Harry, is that it might, if it is the case that it's not this authoritarian clampdown, but it's a clampdown because of weakness and an attempt to legislate everything, could that be even more worrying? It's important to note the distinction. Could that be even more worrying and more suffocating? And what both of you might think could be done about it? So just the question to you, Harry, and then also Claire, what you think might be able to be done about it. You say it's now kind of the horse has bolted, but surely there's always something that we can do about these things.
One of the problems that we've got, you're absolutely right. You point out about the difference between law, rules, guidance, etc. The police don't know. They don't know one from the other. That we found this out absolutely during lockdown, where the police mistook every utterance that came out of Boris's little fireside chats as being law. They treated it as law. Well, of course, it's not law. It wasn't law, but the police didn't know the difference between simple guidance and law. And it's not the job, it never has been the job of the police to enforce guidance. It's the job of the police solely to enforce the law and to keep the peace. Now, one of the problems is the 2002 Police Act introduced a new requirement for police officers, which was to uphold human rights as well as upholding the law. Now, the problem with that is that where you have a human right that is not embodied in British law, what do you do with that? I mean, if Amnesty International say something is a human right, and Stonewall say something is a human right, and the government say something is a human right, well, at that point, the police have to make a decision. Should we uphold it or should we not uphold it? Well, I think the act itself, the commitment to uphold human rights, is incredibly problematic, because it gives justification for the police to go way above and beyond the law and start enforcing what they hope the law may one day be, or in order to enforce laws which someone like Stonewall or Amnesty, that they aspire to be the law. But they simply, they tag the label human right on it, and the police suddenly find themselves in a position where they're confused. And this leads to this very awkward position. For instance, where you have a police force that is a Stonewall champion, part of the Stonewall champion scheme, you will suddenly find that using the wrong pronoun is treated as though it's against the law. Whereas over the county, in an area where they are not Stonewall champions, then that is not upheld. That's not treated as though it's a criminal offence. So we lose that element of foreseeability. The law is supposed to be fundamentally foreseeable. We should be able, it needs to be understandable, and it needs to be foreseeable. And that can't be simply a function of where you happen to be, whether you're in Surrey or whether you're in Lincolnshire. It can't be that. And again, that's where some of the confusion lies.
Right. Thank you, Harry. Claire.
Harry's just explained again very well everything. The difficulty we have is how to respond. I saw somebody in the chat saying something like it's just completely academic why it's happened, because it's all going to be used in an authoritarian fashion. But I mean, look, I'm the director of the Academy of Ideas, and I always think understanding why something's happened is a useful thing, and it can help you work out what you do. But I am slightly at a loss as to know what to do. You know what I mean? I'm not quite sure myself. One thing is that I am nervous, and I think this came up. Certainly, I saw Luke Gittos talk about this. Alan, correct me if I'm wrong. When he did the thing on before for you on was it the human rights law stuff? Because he was making the point that just as I've said that the government cling on to the law to try and compensate for their lack of authority politically, I think that, as it were, opposition, not parties, but political, civil society, political life, ordinary members of the public, think that the way to deal with everything is to change the law as well. Do you know what I mean? Is they hide behind the law. So by the time you're finished, like somebody else said, so although this might not be, as it were, our tribe, you can see how it's happened, which is that, instead of what used to be in my old day, a women's liberation movement where you fought, kind of like kind of make the streets safe. What you weren't calling for a change of the law, right? You actually wanted some lighting occasionally, things like that. But it was kind of more a proactive civil society, change the debate and all the rest of it. Now they want a misogyny hate crime law, right? That they reduced to the law, and even on issues on free speech, I feel the tension around academic freedom and freedom on campus and cancel culture and so on, which is, everybody thinks that the way to solve the problem of cancel culture on campus is to bring in a new law banning censorship. And it's like, what? And I get it. And I probably even support the kind of bolstering of academic freedom through the law. And yet somehow I feel very uncomfortable about it. Because the hard job is trying to convince people of the importance of freedom.
Yeah.
So sad to say. And I think we can safely say that argument's not been won. I think we've all worked out that millions of our fellow citizens who live in a free society have not been exposed to, through no fault of their own, the contemporary arguments for freedom. They need to be convinced of why we need free speech, why we need the right to protest and so on. And we can't also resort to behind the scenes mechanisms or constantly being preoccupied by the law. We need to know what laws are being brought in. Of course, I agree. And somebody also in the chat earlier on had said something like, Lord Sumption said, ignore immoral laws. And, I know that there was quite a lot of people who said things like, I'm just ignoring all the laws and the guidance that got brought out during lockdown. I think that's quite a luxurious position, by the way. If you're a mum or a dad, right, and there's a law and you're going to get charged and you're going to get a big fine, you worry about things like that, right? You worry about giving the wrong impression to your kids or what have you, right? People are, generally speaking, people in this country don't want to break the law, right? But perfectly reasonably, because they're perfectly civilized people. Most of us were not brought up to think of ourselves as criminal. So when they criminalize more things, some people might be gung-ho and say, well, you know, I don't care, criminalize me. But for most people, they want to keep within the confines of being a respectable citizen and a responsible citizen. So in some ways, we need to, dare I say it, you know, go out and win some arguments for freedom and why these things are important, rather than just kind of being performative ourselves and declaratory, you know, I'm on this side. And if you're not on my side, you're a sheeple who doesn't understand, you're being brainwashed. I mean, I hate that. Alan knows that one of my bugbears when people say we are the enlightened ones and all these thick, stupid people. Maybe it's because I'm a Brexiteer, because I got fed up of hearing that then, right? But it's an anti-democratic instinct to describe one's fellow citizens as idiots, right? They are not idiots.
Correct.
We have to convince them. They haven't been brainwashed and they're not being duped, and it's not because they're watching MSM or anything like that. We haven't won the argument with them. It's on us, right? So I think the responsibility of together, moving forward together, is to work out ways, which is why this event is very important tonight. As somebody's just saying, it's immoral and unjust laws. There's loads of immoral and unjust laws, loads of them, right? But I still don't break them, right? I mean, broadly speaking, but what I need to do is convince my fellow citizens that they're immoral and that they're unjust, and organize a campaign and get them overturned. And Harry's a really good example of somebody who's done something really important, which was non-crime hate incidents. I mean, what the hell were they, right? When I first heard that phrase, I didn't know what they were, right? Harry made that a phrase that people in the public knew about and campaigned around it. And so people then become aware of it. Together did so much important work around explaining what the problem of mandating vaccines for health workers and care workers, right? People didn't know about it, right? You weren't a welfare worker or, you know, you brought it to the public attention. That's what political campaigning is all about. So I just think I've got no easy solutions, I'm afraid, at all, but I do know that it's hard work. There's no shortcuts to winning arguments to convince the majority of people to support you, but that's what we need to do.
One of the things is this question about being a sensible and responsible law-abiding citizen, and to what extent you might step outside that, rather than just a cavalier, I don't follow any of it. But even that point would be something that is about engaging people and winning hearts and minds or not. Surely that would be the case. And rather than because a lot of people will say that we should just not obey those things. But I think that the point Claire's raising, and people might disagree with it, but is the idea that we've certainly together tried to appeal to the public and to win over some arguments and hearts and minds. And we're going to continue to do that with the legacy of the things that we've seen in place and some of the things that are still to be challenged. I also think, and I'd be interested to hear what people reckon, even when something is passed as a law, there's all sorts of things you can do about it. You can campaign, you can lobby, you can talk to MP, you can let your MPs know what you think, you can get back to the government. And it's also about a clarity of what it means. If you can get in a position where is a recognition of that and how this is egregious and what that means, you know, things can be turned around again. It's not like they're immutable forever, but that does take work and campaigning and everything. So I can see some hands. I'm just going to go around and we'll take one at a time. We're going to have to unmute you as we go.
There's so much to this, and I don't really know where to start, but I suppose my question is, one question I have is simply, are police officers being trained sufficiently to actually understand when somebody has broken the law? And my other question is, when did it become the case that the police were able to hand down morality? Like, morality is outside of the law, and as long as I'm not imposing myself on other people, so I get offended by things, I don't want to cancel them. You know, everybody's entitled to their own opinion. So this whole sort of cancel culture, and then it becoming a police matter, whether or not you offend people, just strikes me as utterly bizarre. Like, I feel like I've gone to sleep and woken up in bizarro world. That's not actually a question, but can we get to the point, do you think, where we actually distinguish between normative and criminal.
I want to also ask Francis. Francis, you posted a few things in there. Can you come on and say what you're posting? Because I think that there is a sense, it's a counter to Claire's point, that when there's so much media and perhaps propaganda, and there's a one-way narrative of things, that perhaps not all voices are heard in this way, that it's very difficult to actually, you know, there is a question of to what extent people are heavily influenced, whether you want to say they're brainwashed or not. Francis, do you want to make that point? Have I made it for you and say something? And then we've got Christopher, and then I'm going to come back to everyone.
Yeah, I was just saying in the chat there, I think that we complain about like not having won the argument, but the argument can't be won if you can't present the information to the people. So if they're like in the context of lockdown, the lockdown argument, the anti-lockdown argument is not heard, then people don't get to hear it. So how can you persuade people? We're fighting on social media, which is removing people, removing doctors, removing lawyers, whoever's speaking, that the argument is not getting over. It's very simple that if your side of the argument is not heard, then it can't change anyone's mind, can it? I think that's the problem. And the other side of it is, the other side of the argument gets millions and millions of pounds worth of government money, our money, to propagandize us. To think that we weren't propagandized, where you had all the blue and yellow posters everywhere, you had arrows on the ground. It's still there now. If you go to community centers, if you go to train stations, bus stations, that I've been doing recently, it's everywhere. They still have all those signs up. So the propaganda hasn't gone anywhere. That's why so many people are still wearing masks. If you go to Transport for London, it says like, please wear your mask when you board the thing. So the idea that we've not persuaded, it's our failing because we've not made good arguments, is not correct. We're up against a monolithic institution of government that spends millions of pounds, behavioral psychologists, to get inside people's heads and make them behave a certain way. And they have been successful because they hold all the levers of power. That's what's happened.
Okay, thank you. And then just Christopher, and then we're going to come back to Harry and to Claire. Christopher Redmond, please.
Actually, I just want to reiterate what that last speaker just said, and just slightly different. That can we focus the next campaign against the media, because all the things that Claire's saying about, you know, the things that are going wrong have been accentuated by the deterioration in free press and media in the last 2 years. We didn't have a particularly energetic democracy before all this, but we had things like Question Time and you know, we could trust the news. Most of us now are not even watching the news. I'll give you one example. Any Answers on Saturday, the last caller said to Anita Arno, "Well, I'd just like to agree with all the previous callers," and that's one of our bedrock of democracy. So can we focus on getting the media back? Right.
So the first person asked about training the police. And the problem, and these, because it's almost like trying to work out what to do. In a way, what one of the problems is police training. So Harry described that the College of Policing, you think that would be the place where they get all their training, but guess what's happened there, right? They're the bloody problem. Also, the other thing that's happened is, in this attempt to professionalize the police over the last 2 decades, all these police are going off and doing sociology degrees equivalent, or they're all doing policing studies, which are like kind of like low-level sociology degrees. And I kind of know a little bit because I actually was teaching some modules on some of them for a little moment there. And what you realize was it was nothing worse, because you're basically getting these like coppers in, right, and kind of filling their heads with half-baked notions of Foucault, you know what I mean? And sort of like the next minute they're like all wandering out. They half think they know what they're talking about. It's completely pathetic, right? Now, without being too sentimental about it, I mean, the best training for the police is on the streets, as it were, in their communities, talking to people. That's what it used to be. It was like sort of like you learned on the job, you know, you're on the beat. You literally learned your craft on the beat and from your. Now, of course, guess what? Bad things happened, and there were lots of bad things, and there was like lots of corruption. And also, what's more is, they all, guess what? They all had a lot of banter. I mean, they'd never survive it now. I mean, that was kind of like passing on from almost like the senior guys. In fact, I've said guys, it's enough to get me cancelled. From the senior officers down to the lower ranks, this would be, isn't that kind of intergenerational thing? But this is a broader problem than police. But that So I don't think training is going to work. That's the thing I was going to say. But I absolutely agree with the main point that ND made, which was spot on, which is that we've got to remove morality and norms from law, right? And what we set up as normative moral codes, what we decide as a public that we will accept, it's got nothing to do with the law, right? So you can be immoral and legal. You know, so today I did a little, I just got mad in the House of Lords. I just wandered in, they were having this conversation about smoking, like as though it was beheading. I mean, that's the only way to describe it, right? And I stood up and I said, look, why don't you have the courage, if you think smoking's so bad, why don't you make it illegal? I mean, you're frightened to say it because they'll probably come back with that as a plan. But what I can't stand is that they're using these kind of like tightening of the laws to basically demonize anyone. But that's not, and legislation, even though it's not making it illegal. But what they're not doing is, you know, allowing you to be having a public debate about what's morally acceptable. People will then break those moral norms and the public will deal with it. But it's got nothing to do with the law, right? The law should be absolutely narrow and proportionate. And we have to, that's what we've lost sight of. So that's the thing. And therefore you can't in some ways blame the police for becoming basket cases, because they've basically been asked to sort out absolutely every aspect of society. They can't cope. Then the government think they can't cope. We'll give them more things to do or tighten up, give them more rules so they can follow it, as Harry explained brilliantly about the box ticking, more guidance, do it this way, don't do that, and all that. So that's what's going on. Right, that's that. The brainwashing, Francis's point, and the last speaker whose name I didn't catch, and the idea of propaganda and so on are really what you should talk about the next discussion, because we haven't got time to do it now. But I suppose put it this way, right? First of all, I don't think people are brainwashed, and I don't think that the government have got. When people say, you know, they know how to get in your head. I mean, listen, it's money for old rope, right? All that behavioral psychology stuff and the nudge unit. That's what they were trying to do. The idea that you think that it works, they think it works because they're selling it to the government. Don't you fall for it? Of course they don't. They can't get in your head, right? But because we've lost confidence in our own capacity to think for ourselves in a way, we kind of, I mean, in a way, saying that people are brainwashed, it treats them the way the government treat them, which is people you can manipulate. And I'm suggesting that we should bolster the idea that people have agency, can make their own mind up. And to be honest with you, the majority of people supported lockdown during lockdown because they thought that it was a horrible virus, right? And a lot of people at the beginning that was a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And anyway, that's on that. But what I suppose I wanted to emphasize was that sorry, you talked about the media. I'm sorry, I'm being so incoherent. On the media, it's really funny to hear. It's because I'm old, right? I'm saying this. It's really funny having people say, you know, the problem is the media. The media. I mean, it's like that in the golden days, the media would give you a fair shot. I mean, not if you were a bloody miner, it didn't during the miners' strike, by the way. Are you kidding me? They were labelled the enemy within. And what's more, and a lot of people might say, well, I didn't agree with the miners. Well, that's fine. But all I'm saying is there were whole sections of society that never got a look in. And what's more, what's even worse than that, there wasn't GB News, there wasn't talk radio, and there wasn't the bloody internet, right? There was a few of us going out with a leaflet, literally standing outside shopping centres and trying to create alternative media. So it's always been the problem, if you want, that, I mean, I'm being crude because I do know the media is deteriorated, mainstream media, but I'm trying to just emphasize that it's always a struggle to get your message out. And somebody was saying it's not fair because the government give millions of pounds to push their view and it's not fairly distributed. Well, what are you saying? The government should give together half of that money so that you've got a balance? I mean, catch yourself on, it's not happening, right? I mean, the government want you to believe what the government says, don't they? That's what their job is, in a way. That's what they do. So I don't think we can expect a level playing field. I mean, it just feels a little bit complainy.
Okay, thanks.
So can't we, so we have to work harder at building our alternative media streams. And also, by the way, not disbelieving everything the media says. That drives me mad as well. I think that's as moronic. Just because it's on the BBC does not mean you go, it's a lie. That's unhelpful. We're seeing that a lot with the war. Be skeptical about everything, but being cynical, and if they say black, you say white, that's what you do when you're a kid, not when you're a grown-up.
Okay, thank you. Harry?
Yeah, police training, is there enough of it? There's loads of police training. You can get a course on everything. You can get a course on how a trans person is someone whose male brain accidentally grew the wrong body parts. PC Gull from Humberside Police Force went on a course that told him that. You can go on an intersectionality training course at North Yorkshire Police. You can get trained in all kinds of things, but all of this is in place of training in law. That's the problem. We need to get back to training in law, understanding what the law is, understanding what police powers are, understanding what civil liberties are in relation to the law, and having confidence. That's one thing. The second point is this. Yes, we do have a morality police. As Monty Python famously said, no one expects the Inquisition. And we weren't expecting the Inquisition, but that, I'm afraid, is what we have. We have police forces that endlessly hashtag us with be kind, don't be offensive. We even had the case in the Wirral last year of the police taking around a 10-foot billboard into the car parking space at Asda to tell the public that being offensive is an offence. Well, it's not an offence. It's never been an offence. Being offensive is actually part and parcel of a free society. So we have a police force that I don't know whether they're just stupid or whether they're being willfully ignorant or somebody's just yanking their chain. But either way, they're yanking our chain and they are dispersing absolute falsehoods left, right, and centre. And all of it is done in the name of kindness. When it comes to COVID, it seems to me that the police have taken it upon themselves to become defenders of government institutions and defenders of government propaganda, to the extent that last month I ended up having to defend a police officer in North Yorkshire who simply, on a private Facebook page, which does not reveal anywhere that she's a police officer, that she said, I'm not entirely sure about these vaccines. I think perhaps we should just wait for a little bit more data to come in. She was charged with a disciplinary offence. The Police Federation wouldn't defend her because it was their opinion that it was her job as a police officer to uphold the government position. And I went in and said, no, that is not the case. It is never the case that the police are meant to uphold a government body. It's the role of the police to uphold the law. That's the start, the middle, and the end of it. And thankfully, we got her off.
Well, I want to say a couple of things about, just because I had some experience before COVID and actually in sort of 25 years doing events and hospitality. And I really noticed in the latter part of those years, in the last 10 years, there was, Claire talked about some of the football banning orders, but there was an increasing amount of legislation about what the public could do. And also, but it was licensing. It was a lot of the policy discussions that were going on manifested themselves in licensing. So there would be ever more incursions and actually factoring out, taking away police work and making sure there's more private security companies, CCTV. On the one hand, the practical question, the police were worried about their own resource to do things when it was being cut away. We've now seen police stations and others go. But at the same time, the sense that nothing bad should ever happen. And you almost should have an absolutely risk-free environment. And the whole point about the night was it could, used to be spontaneous and I used to joke with the older police about Friday fight night. When people really used to have punch-ups all the time everywhere in Britain. And those of us old enough to remember. And I'm always amazed now when I'm out at how well behaved most people are generally. And yet the discussion is about antisocial behaviour, alcohol-related harms, and the measures are everything from increasing restrictions and impositions on licensed premises that get held accountable as though they're individuals, which in English law, you should individual behaviour, to also things like public space protection orders everywhere. So what's interesting, because some people who I think that it's just been in COVID that some of these things have happened. But actually, like with the nudge unit and other things, we've seen some of these things over the last 15 or 20 years developing. And I mean, I wonder, as these things have developed as we've gone down the road, the question about what it really is going to take, not just to try and win some hearts and minds, as Claire says, but there seems to be a really, what you're both saying, something that at the heart of the institutions and at the heart of our culture, which is about authority and believing that you have some sense of control, and people can use judgment to deal with things and handle things, and that actually you're not at risk all the time, because the state themselves, the elite, people who run things perhaps feel like they're at risk of everything, right? And they have to mitigate every single risk from this blob, the public, the terrible, dangerous mob or masses. And so, you know, that's something for us all to think about. In the immediacy, I'm also interested to hear what other people think on the call as well about the police bill, or any other final points before we go to wrap up. Yeah, go on, Harry.
One of the problems we have, again, comes from the College of Policing. The College of Policing are now insisting that only graduates become police officers. And again, this is not because the College of Policing want highly intelligent individuals. They want officers who have learnt how not to think, who have learnt how not to think critically, but who have learnt to tick box learning outcomes, like Claire, I've taught in higher education through to master's level. And it's shocking. It's absolutely shocking. You can teach a monkey to get a pass at masters if you can only get them to write down the correct form of words in order to satisfy a learning outcome. And that's the kind of officer that the College of Policing wants, because they're tame. They've abandoned common sense for a set of top-down principles and rules, and that's why they are insisting on that. They do not want the old-fashioned common sense Bobby. Dixon of Dock Green could not have become a police officer under the College of Policing.
When so I know that this might make me sound a bit obsessive because I'm about to say the words Brexit, but when the government announced that they were going to have a referendum to leave the EU, I thought it would be a fair fight, right? And that basically we'd have the arguments whether we should stay in the EU or leave the EU. Never dawned on me, because I'm an idiot, it never dawned on me that the whole of the media, all of the political parties, with the exception of some Tories, but all the front benches, the main establishment, every institution, every university, everyone who mattered in society would say Brexit was a bad idea. They used nudge, they used every possible method. They tried. They did the fear. People are making it sound as though fear mongering started under COVID. Let me tell you, I mean, this was fear, right? Fear, you know, as porn, right? It was out there all the time, right? They went on, and I assumed in that context that there was no chance at all that ordinary people would be able to withstand the threats, the pressure, the fear-mongering, the misinformation, the media onslaught, being demonized and called racist, Neanderthal types who didn't understand anything, Russian, bought by the Russians, and so on and so forth. I thought that would, right? Anyway, how wrong was I, right? And they won. They didn't stop. If you remember, a couple of days after the referendum result came through, when I was shocked that Leave won, somebody said to me, you know, the establishment won't let it happen. And I thought, don't be ridiculous. I'm revealing to you my naivety. Don't be ridiculous. They won't try and stop it, right? Anyway, I was wrong again, right? And for the next 3-4 years, all out onslaught, every part of the establishment was geared up to overturning the vote to leave the European. And I thought there's no chance it's ever going to happen now, right? I was wrong again. And why was I wrong? Because a majority of people in the country voted to leave the European Union, and then, against all the odds, worked it out themselves, did their own research, and similarly, despite the bullying, despite the demonization, they then basically withstood that. And so the reason I'm saying that is, and there might be loads of people here who will remain voters, it's not really my point. The point I'm making is that that's what politics is like, right? you know, you can't, people don't behave the way you want. They're not your stage army or my stage army. But if they're convinced and they convince each other and their colleagues and all the rest of it, amazing things can happen. You can change the course of history, as they did. And, you know, who knows what Brexit means and all the rest of it. And we had COVID straight after, I know that. The point I'm making is that that vote was not meant to be won by ordinary people. It wasn't meant to be, and they defied that. And every time anything happens historically, it's because people go against the prevailing, you know, that's why I was funny about nudge. I remember when they brought that nudge theory out, right? And they said, well, basically, we never have to have an argument with anyone again. We'll manipulate everyone. Now, in view of the fact that people on this call presumably were not nudged and not manipulated, unless we all think we're geniuses, I assume that what happened was it didn't work, right? Of course, it has a bit of an impact on you. But just somebody said, well, advertising wouldn't work. But it's also true that, as I've always said, I watch lots of adverts and I don't do what they tell me to do. And I use the technique of getting my teenage nephew to watch every single possible cleaning advert going, and he's never yet washed up, right? It doesn't work like that. People resist the power of being told what to do. And it's not because we're all geniuses, but because we have the capacity to make our own minds up. We have agency. But it doesn't mean they won't try and batter you into submission. But I just think we've got to believe that, because there's danger after the battering we've had under COVID and lockdown, and now we're in the middle of this terrible war, which could reshape the whole of Europe. The danger is that we become despondent about the capacity to change, and we become despondent about everyone else and just think it's hopeless. And I want to say it isn't, but it's bloody hard work, because the reason why we left the EU in the end was because ordinary people worked their guts out to persuade other people, and it became a movement.
So I think that, I mean, I know Claire's got to go in a minute. Basically, I'm going to ask just for a couple of final comments. I would just say to Pete, I mean, Claire's just said a lot there, so I think you can, if you've got to run, that's...
I've really got to, I feel so rude.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Listen, thanks very much. And I'm sorry I was all over the place, and I apologize for messing you around. And Harry Miller is brilliant. And the Together campaign is to be commended, because you also made a huge difference. So I could have used that. It's not quite as dramatic as Brexit, but bloody hell, I didn't think you stood a chance, by the way, on vaccine mandates, and you defied it. So I'm really impressed. So don't give up hope, and see you all soon face to face next time.
So just to say, thank you to Claire Fox and thank you to Harry. We've got in this series of 4, the next one that we've got upcoming is going to be on digital ID and central bank digital currency. And in fact, all of the separate sessions have a relationship to one another as well, because some of the discussion says that actually all of this is part of a big plan, and from suffocating speech and big tech to controlling the long arm of the state, stopping protests, and then what's going to happen is there's few people that made this plan. They're going to get everyone's going to get digital ID. We're going to have, central bank fiat currency, and that's going to be that. And then others will look at some of the concerns in each of these areas, and they'll say, well, actually, it could go this way, it could go that way, but there are genuine democratic and rights concerns about the risks to our freedoms. And we've been quite keen to interrogate some of those ideas and get underneath them. And actually what we found together is, even if we don't agree sometimes on what the causes are, what's the actual actions to challenge them and to support our freedoms and rights and demand them in a democratic free society, have been something that's been very unifying for everyone. And I think that's an important thing. And the next event we've got is on Monday, the 28th. And it's very exciting because we've got some great speakers. We've got Majid Nawaz, we've got Laura Dodsworth that some people have been speaking about on here. So, the state of fear, Jeffrey Peel, Tom Salmon, who's very big on Bitcoin. We might have a surprise guest as well that we'll let you know about. So that's going to be happening on Monday, the 28th. It's actually live. We're going to let you know. There are only going to be a certain amount of spaces, so they'll go very quickly, but it's also going to be live streamed. Just to say, I'm going to ask Harry for any final thoughts on this in a second, but we do think it together, as we know, that we've seen, and this is important as well, because, Francis has campaigned and he's been very active, but it's also the case that many people said to us at the start, why would you even bother contacting MPs? they're all part of the problem. And then when people saw that actually contacting MPs and also pressurizing the government and getting into the press and doing social media and organizing locally and working with lots of hubs, doing that whole approach had an impact on winning hearts and minds and winning the conversations. And I think that thing's really important about what can be done. And around this bill, I think it's important to let our MPs and also the government know where we stand on this. And we think it's unacceptable that there should be these measures that say that how noisy a protest is, but also the questions behind that. Some of the ones we looked at today, the idea that you have to keep making laws to control every possible outcome, rather than actually allowing us to lead a free life within the very large amount of laws that currently exist in society. And I think we can do that. We're going to have some calls to action as well once we know what the outcome tomorrow on the online safety bill is. But I'm going to give over to Harry now, just a few reflections from this evening and final thoughts on maybe what you think could be done and what this is going to mean with the police bill.
Okie dokie. So I think we've covered in the substance very well tonight, and I don't really want to add anything more to it. I just want to speak to you all as potential activists now, really. I think what you need, there are three absolute essentials when it comes to activism, as far as I'm concerned. First of all, you need conviction. You need real conviction. You have to believe in the cause. You have to believe that what you're doing is right, that it makes the country, not just yourself, but the country a better place. Secondly, you need courage. And added to courage, you need stamina. Because without courage, you will just drive yourself nuts. You'll have the idiots like we had on tonight who try to put you off your stride. You'll have lawyers scaring you with threats of exorbitant costs. You'll have family members who don't quite see it your way, or who are worried about your mental health, or are worried about their mental health, or are worried about privacy, and who are desperate to sort of drag you back into the fold. So you need courage. And finally, you need community. You need to gather around you people who are like-minded, who have a similar conviction, and then just relax into that community and let your friends, the people who are on side, your allies, help you fight the fight. That's the only way that I managed to do it, was with that courage, commitment, or conviction, and community. So I think they're my final thoughts to everyone on this.
What a brilliant way to finish. Harry, thank you so much. And courage is, and also from the French and the Latin courage, which also means being inspired. I think that's very true. And also having stamina. So here's to that. And thank you for joining us tonight, Harry. Thank you for everyone. And it really, I think what this evening does is it shows a number of areas to think about. On the one hand, many of us already had a response and reaction against the egregious elements that we all saw in this bill, but also the questions behind it and what that means and what we can do ongoing about it. We're certainly going to recommend that we carry on being vocal and challenging things together and the specific areas of the bills that we're unhappy about, and that we have a voice for the public, a public square, that now we've got some kind of relationship with many people across the UK. The government knows about us, the opposition knows about us, and we do have an element of having reached some people in the media and social media. And we're going to continue with that. And we want everyone to do that with us. And we know that things are very confusing at the moment. The whole tragedy is terrible, what's happening in Ukraine. But at the same time, we still face many issues here. And if, you know, freedom means one thing, it's to call our own elected representatives to account here for our freedom and rights and insist upon them and make sure that we get back to a proper old normal, perhaps with some improvements. So that's what we're looking to do together. We also know that the inquiry is now open, so we're going to be submitting a very significant document about making sure that the scope of it and the terms of reference are included, as well as we're going to be advocating for an independent one that we'll be involved with. So I want to thank everyone this evening. Look out for what's going to be happening on the 28th, and we'll be coming back to you really soon. Thank you very much, and thanks again, Harry.
Been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Good night, guys.